Let me begin by congratulating Senator Kennedy for his strong leadership on the need to raise the minimum wage, a minimum wage that has not been raised for 10 years. And let me also congratulate my colleague from Ohio, the current president of the Senate, for his fine remarks, which I certainly concur with. Mr. President, the United States of America is the richest country in the history of the world. Unfortunately, despite our great wealth, nearly 13% of our citizens are living in poverty, and we have today the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country in the industrialized world. In my opinion, we have a moral responsibility to end childhood poverty in America. Therefore, the amendment that I am offering today simply expresses the sense of the Senate that, number one, we have a moral obligation to improve the lives of nearly 37 million Americans living in poverty, including nearly 13 million children. Number two, we have got to address the reality that in the United States today, we have by far the most unfair distribution of wealth and income of any major industrialized country, and that we have a moral obligation to reduce that growing gap between the rich and the poor. And number three, and most importantly, that this amendment calls upon the President to submit a plan to Congress which eradicates childhood poverty over the next decade and reduces the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Mr. President, as a nation, we are often very proud of our accomplishments. How often do we hear people say, USA, number one? And I share that sentiment. And certainly in so many areas, our country is leading and has led the rest of the world, and we are all very proud of that. Unfortunately, in terms of childhood poverty within the industrialized world, we are also number one. We are number one in having the highest rate of childhood poverty among any major country in the world, and that is not a number one that we should be proud of. Mr. President, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the childhood poverty rate in the United States today is nearly 18%. According to data from the Luxembourg Income Study Group, the childhood poverty rate in the United States is even higher, almost 22%. Well, let us take a look at what childhood poverty rates are in other major countries, in many of the countries that we compete against economically. In Germany, the childhood poverty rate is 9%. In France, it's 7.9%. In Austria, 6.7%. In Sweden, it is 4.2%. Norway, 3.4%. And in Finland, the childhood poverty rate is only 2.8%. 2.8% in Finland, over 18% in the United States of America. There is something wrong with that equation. Mr. President, have other countries succeeded when they put their minds to it to reducing childhood poverty rates? And the answer is yes. In 1999, the British government, our good friends in the United Kingdom, made a commitment to address childhood poverty. 6 years later, child poverty in the United Kingdom had been cut by 20%. Similar progress, as I understand it, has been made in Ireland. Unfortunately, at the same time that Britain was taking important steps to reduce childhood poverty, in the United States, childhood poverty increased by about 12%. The situation is bad, and we are moving in the wrong direction. Mr. President, when we hear our fellow senators come to this floor and they say the United States is the greatest country on earth, I share that sentiment. But I do not share the sentiment that the greatest country on earth should have by far the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world, and that rate is growing higher and higher. We have got to address that issue. We cannot sweep it under the carpet. Mr. President, while we continue to have the highest rate of childhood poverty, and while over 5 million more Americans have slipped into poverty since George W. Bush has been president, there is another issue that this Senate has got to address, and that is the growing oligarchic nature of our society. It's not talked about too much, but I think we should place it on the table. Today, the wealthiest 1% of Americans own more wealth than do the bottom 90%, and the CEOs of our largest corporations now earn over 800 times what a minimum wage worker earns. Today in America, the wealthiest 13,000 families, who constitute 1/100th of 1% of the population, receive almost as much income as the bottom 20 million American families in the United States. 1/100th of 1% receive almost as much income as the bottom 20 million American families. That, in my view, is not what America is supposed to be. Mr. President, working with the President of the United States, working in a bipartisan manner, we have got to come up with ideas, place them on the table, and end the disgrace of having the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. Other countries are making progress. We can do the same. Yes, Mr. President, at the same time, we have got to reverse this trend by which fewer and fewer people own more and more wealth, while more and more people have less, while poverty increases, and while the middle class shrinks. Mr. President, the true greatness of a country does not lie in the number of millionaires and billionaires that it has. Rather, a great nation is one in which justice, equality, and dignity prevail. Mr. President, let me close by a quote that none other than President George W. Bush made on January 20th, 2001. And let me quote from President Bush. "In the quiet of American conscience, we know that deep, persistent poverty is unworthy of our nation's promise. Where there is suffering, there is duty. Americans in need are not strangers. They are citizens, not problems, but priorities. And all of us are diminished when any are hopeless. And I can pledge our nation to a goal. When we see that wounded traveler on the road to Jericho, we will not pass to the other side." End of quote, George W. Bush. The President was right to make that pledge, but since he made that statement, we all know that over 5 million more Americans have slipped into poverty, including over 1 million children. Mr. President, let us turn that pledge to reality. We can begin to do that by raising the minimum wage, and we can begin to do that by coming up with a plan, with a program, with legislation which eliminates childhood poverty in America and lowers the gap between the rich and the poor. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Amen. Yes.